This Saturday at noon Eastern Time, we have the Nebraska Cornhuskers, who are 5-1, 2-1 in Big Ten Conference play, traveling to the 16th ranked, bowl-eligible, undefeated, dominant, 6-0, 3-0 in Big Ten Conference play, Indiana Hoosiers. That is a mouthful, but you're going to see why in this video. I'm telling you, Indiana is a real team, and so is Nebraska. And that is why, despite the fact that we have Georgia-Texas, which in the grand scope of things in the national title picture is the biggest game of the week, and then we have Alabama-Tennessee, we have Oregon traveling as the second-ranked team to Purdue, which history says could be rife for an upset, but we'll have to see. And we have Michigan versus Illinois, which features two ranked top 25 teams. We have all those games. Many of them, especially the two SEC ones, and perhaps Michigan, Illinois, would be viewed as more consequential than this matchup. But I disagree with that. This is the matchup that I will be paying the most attention to. The one where my eyes will be glued for all 60 minutes of game time and really 3 to 4 hours of real lifetime. And I'm going to explain why. Here's why that is. These teams are both legit. They're technically both in the college football playoff conversation. Indiana easily is. Nebraska can afford a loss to Ohio State, and if they beat everyone else, which is possible, though not favored, just in the sense that Indiana is not favored to beat everyone but Ohio State, they would be in that conversation at 10-2. Indiana easily is in that conversation at 11-1. Both of these teams have their strengths, and they have their weak links, but their weak links are not massive, crippling weaknesses. These teams are well coached. They're very much improved compared to their prior season's counterparts, especially Indiana. Did you know that when these teams met last, they ended the season both with 4-8 records? Indiana was 2-7 in conference. Nebraska was 3-6. The last time these two schools met, 2 years ago in 2022, when Ohio State was elite as they always are, when Michigan was elite and having a dominant year, when Penn State was near elite, still hasn't broken through yet this day, and then hopefully that changes this season as we like chaos here. But anyway, things in the Big Ten were the Big Ten. Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA were in the Pac-12. But anyway, enough rambling on my part. The point is, these teams have made one of the biggest glow-ups, plural, that I have seen in the previous two seasons. From 4-8 teams in 2022 when they faced off and Nebraska won 35-21 in ugly fashion with Casey Thompson. And Connor Bazelak, now Bowling Green's quarterback, was Indiana's in that game. These two teams now have a combined record of 11-1. They have a combined conference record of 5-1. And their only loss collectively is to an Illinois team who's in the top 25. That's it. And they're both top 20 in game control, which is a metric that we'll get into. And they both have a pretty good points per play margin. All the analytics, all the things that we love to talk about on this channel, the things that we view as positive indicators, Nebraska and Indiana are ripe with those. It's Matt Rule versus Curt Cignetti. Two coaches who many do not view as serious coaches, which is a very casual take, but it's the case. And both are serious coaches who are proven program builders. So let's dive in. Enough of my chatter, but that's why I'm very excited to watch this game, because of the records, the dominance, the talent. This is a legitimate matchup. It is. It is not some game that was just slid into the noon column to keep the fan bases happy because you have to televise all the games. No, this is a legitimate matchup that I am excited to watch, that any college football fan is excited to watch. And if you are excited to watch, please subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, like the video, comment your prediction for this game and any analysis you have on the two teams down in the comment section below. Share this video around to other college football fans, to Indiana fans and Nebraska fans especially. Nebraska fans are some of the biggest supporters, if not the biggest supporters relative to fan base of this channel. And as for Indiana fans, I haven't covered you guys a lot because you have been pretty, well, bad every year. But you're doing really well. And I want the more you guys are on the channel, the merrier. That's the case with every Big Ten fan base. And speaking of that, also please join my Discord server via the link in the description and down below in the pinned comment, where we talk college football 24/7. And if you want to support the channel monetarily, you can look at the Patreon page or the merchandise store via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. But ultimately, joining the Discord server, liking, sharing, subscribing, hitting the bell, and commenting, those things are free, and they do the most to help out the channel. And we're nearing 20,000 subscribers, which I'm very excited for. But I'm pumped to talk about this game, and here's why. The Football Power Index and S&P Plus metrics really tell the whole story here. Indiana is viewed as about a 2 to 3 score team relative to the average college football team. What that means is they are viewed as a good, great team. They're not just viewed as above average or average. Indiana, per analytics, is viewed as one of the better teams in the country. Not just the Big Ten, in the country. We will have to see if what the power ratings have said through half of Indiana's season pan out. If they do, we could be looking at Indiana in the 12-team playoff, which is just nuts. You may even be looking at Indiana potentially reaching Indy. I'm not going to go that far. That is far less likely to the easy schedule and the game at Ohio State compared to just making the playoff. Ironically, now it's easier to reach the playoff if you're a part of the SEC or Big Ten, way easier than reaching your conference championship game, but it's a topic for another day. And it's understandable because the winner of that game inevitably gets one of the really top 2 seeds, or maybe 3 at worst, in those 2 power conferences. But Nebraska is still viewed as better than the average college football team. About a touchdown better per FPI, 2 touchdowns better per S&P Plus. Let me read you the specific numbers. Nebraska is viewed as 6.4 points superior to the average college football team per ESPN's FPI. Per S&P Plus, they are viewed as 13.5 points better than the average college football team. Per FPI, Indiana is viewed as 14.1 points better than the average college football team. And in S&P Plus, they're viewed as 16.2 points better than the average college football team. You add in the fact that Indiana is now filling their stands, and, well, Cignetti is satisfied with that. You get about 3 points home field advantage on average for college football teams. That's the spread for home field advantage. For a school like Texas, Michigan, especially Oregon with Autzen Stadium, for LSU with Death Valley, Georgia's Sanford Stadium, the Horseshoe, Beaver Stadium, especially in a whiteout, I'd say you could give even 5, 6, or 7 points home field advantage. For Indiana, let's just stick with 3. Right now, basically, whether it's FPI or S&P Plus, the metrics are saying Indiana should win this game by anywhere from about 2 field goals or 6 points to maybe 10 or 11 touchdowns. Or not 10 or 11 touchdowns, my goodness, points. But I am thinking about touchdowns a lot because Indiana has done a very efficient job of scoring touchdowns. It feels like in some of their games they're scoring 10 or 11 touchdowns. You look at their points per play margin, and points per play margin is how is the team you are looking at score per play compared to how much their opponent on an average basis, averaged out across all the games they've played so far, scored per play. A points per play margin of 0.326 that Indiana has is indicative that on an average basis, Indiana is beating their opponents by multiple scores. On an average basis, they are blowing out, dominating their opponents. They're not quite doing it at the national championship caliber. That would be about like around a 0.4 points per play margin or higher, given the schedule that they have. But Indiana is a great team. They're very efficient, particularly on offense. It's more of the defense is the reason why they're not higher in points per play margin. And you look at Nebraska, they have a 0.175 points per play margin. This is still a team that, keep in mind, owned Colorado, which no one else has done all season long. The only team that's done it with Deion Sanders there as the head coach, and Shadur Sanders and Travis Hunter are some of the better players of the sport, is Oregon last year, and then Nebraska this year. And they also have a win over Rutgers, a 14-7 win. So they have some respectable wins. Indiana, I would say, given how some of their opponents have functioned, mainly Northwestern, what they did to Maryland, and also the way they beat Maryland at one point, leading them 42-21 despite having a -4 turnover margin, shows how dominant Indiana is. And as for Nebraska, they're more of the boa constrictor style. They're a lot more defensive. The reason they aren't higher in points per play margin is their offense. For Indiana, it's their defense. So you have some contrasting styles here as to how these teams have approached winning at a high level. I'm so excited for this matchup. I really am. Whether it's go Hoosiers or go Big Red, please type that in the comment section. And let's get this video to 10,000 views. I think we can do that. Looking more at a broad team comparison here, these teams' strength of schedules, especially recently, have tanked. At first, it looked like Nebraska might have a respectable strength of schedule early because of Illinois and Rutgers and also Colorado. Well, Illinois won by a point this past weekend over a Purdue team who was dog poop. And Rutgers got blown out by Wisconsin, and Colorado lost to Kansas State. So all of those things considered, also the fact that Illinois got game controlled by Penn State on the road, and Penn State didn't even play an A-level game on offense, you see that loss to Illinois doesn't look as good as it used to. And losses never look good, but it's not looking as good now. Same with the win over Rutgers, for example. And as for Indiana, well, their best win of the year is probably at Northwestern, and Northwestern is not a good team. 3-3. Same thing with Maryland, 3-3. Like they actually haven't played anyone. They haven't. It's actually kind of confusing to me that Nebraska has a weaker strength of schedule than Indiana does. I think that maybe because FPI really likes Maryland due to some priors, but Maryland this year is a bad football team. They're straight up a bad football team. Regardless of their weak strength of schedules, though, they're both top 20 in game control. This means that fewer than 20 teams could handle their respective schedules better than the Hoosiers and Huskers did. Nebraska's 18th in game control. Indiana is 4th. I'm going to say it again. 4th in game control. The computers really, really like Indiana. And there are reasons why that is. One of them is right here. It's Indiana's passing attack. And I think that the critical matchup of this game is how Nebraska's defense does against this offensive line, the tight ends, wide receivers, and quarterback more specifically of the Hoosiers. How does this work? How does Indiana's passing attack perform against a Nebraska pass defense that has NFL players, that has a ridiculously high ceiling, but also has shown some vulnerability? And as for Indiana, well, they haven't played a defense anywhere close to this caliber. Nebraska right now is rated number 1 in defensive S&P+. No one else that Indiana has faced comes even close to that. And Northwestern has a good defense. Nebraska's is near elite to elite right now. And it could end up being the number 1 defense in the country. If they shut down Indiana's offense with the offensive struggles that Nebraska has, there's a pretty good chance that's indicative of Tony White commanding the nation's number 1 defense. But let's look at Indiana's passing attack. Curtis Rourke this year from Canada, 118 completions, 116 pass attempts, 1,752 passing yards. He completes 73.8% of his passes. Through 6 games, he's averaging 10.9 yards per attempt. 14 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He's only been sacked 5 times. He has a 192.1 passer rating. And his leading receivers are Elijah Surratt, Omar Cooper Jr., Miles Price, Miles Cross, Keyshawn Williams, tight end Zach Horton. You look, and all of those players I mentioned outside of Zach Horton have at least 100 receiving yards or more. Surratt has 513 already, with 2 receiving touchdowns on 29 receptions. Omar Cooper Jr. has 375 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, and 18 receptions. He's averaging over 20 yards per reception. And Price, he's averaging 13 yards per reception. Cross is averaging 12 with 2 touchdowns. Keshawn Williams leads the team in receiving touchdowns with 4. Zach Horton has 2 receiving touchdowns. This passing offense is a thing of beauty. It's absolutely a thing of beauty. When you look at Indiana football and what they brought over from James Madison, because most of their roster is made up from former James Madison players, I would have never thought that with how dominant James Madison's defense was last year, that it would be Mike Shanahan and Tino Sansuri as the offensive coordinator and co-offensive coordinator that would be leading the charge for Indiana's success rather than Kurt Cignetti and Bryant Haynes and the defense that they brought over from James Madison, which was extremely dominant. They also had a good offense at James Madison, but this offense is electric. And along with Justice Ellison at running back with 409 rushing yards, 6 rushing touchdowns, we'll get to him when we look at these offenses in detail. But that unit going up against a Nebraska pass defense that on the season has 7 interceptions, 2 pick sixes, 24 passes defended. Nebraska's passing defense this season is 5th in sack percentage, and that doesn't count the game against Northern Iowa from teamrankings.com. They don't count games against FCS teams. They're getting 3.6 sacks per game. Nebraska is only allowing 6.2 opponent yards per pass attempt and 10.4 opponent yards per completion. And teams only complete about 60% of their passes on this Nebraska secondary. And Nebraska only surrenders about a 121.8 opponent average team passer rating. And they've played, by the way, Shedeur Sanders and Luke Altmaier, who have very impressive passer ratings, who have done a very good job of throwing touchdowns, limiting interceptions as a general rule. Neither of them have been that well protected. It's weird to think about that they may actually be more similar than different in a way. Luke Altmaier and Shedeur Sanders. Never thought I would be saying that, but Altmaier's been very, very good. I was watching some of his film against Purdue, and he kind of willed that team from completely imploding against a very bad Purdue team. Good on him. He's one of the better quarterbacks in the country this year. Nebraska's played those quarterbacks, and while Altmaier killed them, along with Zachary Franklin and their tight end, whose name is escaping me for whatever reason, Tanner Arkin, and also Pat Bryant, they limited Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter. And they also did a good job against a Rutgers passing offense that looked respectable entering their matchup against the Cornhuskers. They totally shut that unit down, made Kaliakmanis look like a deer in headlights. So this is the matchup that I'm paying attention to. I think it's what decides the game. Ultimately, when you compare these two offenses, I do think Indiana's is better. You look at how how they've ran the ball, how they've thrown the ball. They have the better quarterback. They have the better wide receivers. They have overall the better offensive line. It's not the greatest offensive line in the world. I think Nebraska's better at guard as a whole. Indiana's better at center and better at tackle. And at running back's kind of a push, and I didn't think I'd be saying that, except for the fact that Nebraska's only running, and I know that we're not exactly adjusting for sacks here, but about 3.9 yards per carry. If you adjust for sacks, it looks to be about like 4.5 yards per carry. Indiana's averaging 5.1 yards per carry, and if you adjust for sacks, that may be closer to 5.5. Indiana has 1,202 rushing yards, 5.1 yards per carry, 23 rushing touchdowns. Nebraska's 820 rushing yards, 3.9 yards per carry, and 11 rushing touchdowns. Nebraska has ran the football only 23 fewer times than Indiana has for close to 400 fewer yards. 382 fewer yards to be exact. No, 388 to be exact, I believe, or maybe 378. Yeah. Anyway, it's actually 382. I shouldn't be thinking about this, but yeah, it's 382. I just don't like to be wrong when I can help it. But when I am wrong, I admit it. And something that I was wrong about was, well, obviously I didn't see Indiana's offense coming and being this efficient, but also I think Nebraska's offense a bit. I thought that Nebraska would be better at running the football than they are. And I thought that Raiola would be playing actually a little bit better at quarterback. However, I've been very impressed with their receivers, specifically Nair and Jamal Banks, the incoming transfers, who lead the team in receiving yards, each with over 200. Nair has 291, Banks has 283. Nair has 4 receiving touchdowns, Banks has 2. They combined for 6 of Nebraska's 9 receiving touchdowns. Raiola has 1,358 passing yards. He's averaging 8 yards per pass attempt. He has a 66.9 completion percentage, 9 touchdowns, 3 picks, a 148.4 passer rating. His QBR, by the way, his QBR is 53rd. You look at Curtis Rourke's QBR, and it is second. He has a 91.9 QBR. I'm just telling you, Indiana's offense is good. It is not a unit to be trifled with. And you look at, again, comparing, let's just do scoring offense. Indiana scores 0.605 points per play. That's 10th. And Nebraska only scores 0.377 points per play, which is 65th. Indiana, they gain a point every time they gain 11.5 yards, which is 12th. Nebraska gains a point every time they gain 13.8 yards, which is 56th, roughly. Indiana is first in red zone scoring attempts per game with 5.8 and red zone scores per game with 5.6. And Indiana scores an average of 5.6 offensive touchdowns per game, which is 5th. Nebraska only scores an average of 3.2, which is 55th. And remember, Nebraska can't kick a field goal, from what we know. Indiana, while sometimes reluctant to do so because they're aggressive, does have a better kicking game. And you look at rushing offense, Indiana, this is, again, not factoring against FCS opponents. The ESPN stats I just read you do. These don't. Indiana averages 4.7 yards per carry on the ground. Nebraska averages 3.6. Indiana through the air averages 10 yards per pass attempt, which is 7th, 14.4 yards per completion, which is 12th. Nebraska's 52nd and 78th in those categories, respectively. So there you have it. I think Indiana clearly has the better offense. I think that is as clear as night is today. However, defensively, it's kind of the opposite here. I think Indiana is a little bit better at safety, but Nebraska is pretty much way better at everything else. Nebraska, again, is the number 1 defense in S&P+. It is a top 25 defense per ESPN's efficiency metrics. Meanwhile, Indiana's is not even top 50 in ESPN's efficiency metrics. You look at scoring defense, Indiana only allows 17.2 opponent points per game, which is 12th. Nebraska allows 13th, which is 8th. For Nebraska, they force opponents to have to gain 20.5 yards to gain 1 single point. That's 9th. 20.5 opponent yards per point. For Indiana, that's 16.4, 36th. Indiana allows opponents to score 0.278 points per play. Nebraska only allows opponents to score 0.202 points per play, which is 7th. Nebraska limits opponents to only scoring 1.6 offensive touchdowns per game, which is 10th. Indiana limits opponents to only scoring 2.2 offensive touchdowns per game, which is 21st. So Indiana's defense, I still think, is a above average, maybe good unit, though they have not played really any offenses of note. I think they faced better defenses than offenses. Let's look at total defense, for example. Nebraska only allows opponents to gain 4.2 yards per play, which is 6th. Indiana 4.6 yards per play, which is 16th. You look at rushing defense, Nebraska only allows opponents to run for 2.5 yards per carry on them, which is 3rd, and only gain about 73.2 rushing yards per game, which is 2nd. Top 3 in rushing defense, not bad at all. Indiana, meanwhile, allows opponents to average nearly 98.2 rushing yards per game, 16th, and 3.5 opponent yards per carry, which is 30th. And in passing defense, Indiana actually leads Nebraska in opponent yards per pass attempt, 5.9, and opponent yards per completion, 9.4, as opposed to 6.2 and 10.4 for Nebraska, respectively. But keep in mind, Nebraska has played significantly better passing offenses. I mean, Colorado's and Indiana's is far above any passing offense that Indiana's played all year. Even Maryland. I know that Maryland has Caden Prather and they have Ty Felton, but Billy Edwards Jr. is not as good as Shedeur Sanders or Luke Altmaier. He isn't. And I don't think Maryland is as well coached as Illinois. And I don't know, but I think Colorado is a better team than Maryland. Colorado may actually be better coached than Maryland based off of what I have watched. You look at these you look at these teams, and defensively, I just think it's very clear that Nebraska has the edge. For Nebraska, they're front of Jamari Butler, Nash Hutmacher, MJ Sherman, Ty Robinson, James Williams, Cameron Lenhart, Princewell, Unman Malin, Kai Wallen, Elijah Judy, Riley Van Poppel. They're very deep in their three-man defensive front with the 3-3-5 that Tony White runs. For Indiana, I like what they have up front too with James Carpenter, CJ West, Marcus Burris Jr., Linnell Carr, Mikhail Kamara. But Nebraska is further ahead. They are. You look at their pass rush, they've earned 20 sacks on the season. Indiana, by comparison, facing weaker teams, is forced 19. These defenses are close, but there still is a pretty good gap between them. And close, I would say more so statistically. If you dig deeper into opponents and watching how they've played, I think it's very evident that Nebraska's is better, and perhaps by a long shot. So those are some just statistics on the offense and defense to look at. For Indiana, defensively, I would say pay attention to their secondary, D'Angelo Ponge, Josh Sanguinetti, Sean Asbury II, Jameer Johnson, Amari Farrell, and that unit, because Nebraska probably has a higher upside right now at passing the football than running the football. They will want to run the ball, but Raiola had a pretty off game against Rutgers. I think he'll perform better in this game than he did against Rutgers, and it wouldn't shock me at all if Nebraska wanted to pass, utilize their receivers, tight ends, Raiola's pocket awareness, and his arm. Look out for those players in Indiana's defense, really those secondary players I named. And as for Nebraska, look out for Tommy Hill. It sounds like he might return for this game, which would be huge given the efficiency of Indiana's passing offense. And also pay attention to Nash Hutmacher and Ty Robinson. And James Williams had a big game against Rutgers, so potentially look for him to be more involved. Look for that front, which also includes Jamari Butler, MJ Sherman, Princewell, Unman Malin. And how will they do against an offensive line of Indiana's that hasn't exactly been majorly tested yet, but is putting up some very impressive numbers and helping out the offense be one of the nation's and Big Ten's better offenses statistically this season? I would look, a little bit of hair that's annoying, in the trenches. I think these teams are pretty equal. Nebraska's the better defensive line. Indiana's the better offensive line. If you put a gun to my head, I really don't know. Honestly, I couldn't tell you who's better in the trenches. And I think that while that will be in part a determining factor on Saturday, there are more than enough differences on these rosters to where I can point to other reasons why one of these teams will win. I do think that it's so weird. It's very weird. I do think Nebraska. I think Nebraska's slightly, if you put a gun to my head, I'd probably side with Nebraska in the trenches. But Indiana, I'd easily side with on special teams, and I think Indiana offensively has, at this point, the much better performing skill position talent, and their secondary talent outside of a player like Tommy Hill, who's awesome, and maybe Cirar Wright, he's done very well with the Huskers, wouldn't be that much different overall compared to what Indiana has in their secondary and defensive backfield. Trenches, really is equal. I can easily see either of these teams being better there. Indiana, though, is obviously better at special teams. Nebraska hasn't even made half of their field goal attempts, and they've only made about 9 of them. Wonder if Tristan Alvano will be healthy for this game, because if he is and he can make field goals, that could be a big difference here. And as for the coaching edge, I'd give Nebraska the edge on defense. I think Tony White's one of the best defensive coordinators in the country, and he has good assistants. As for Indiana, I really like what Curt Cignetti and Mike Shanahan have done with this offense. With it being top 10 in efficiency, Indiana being top 5 in game control really due to their offense, top 10 in points per play scored by offense. Also, something else to consider, I didn't mention this, I kind of brushed over it. Indiana is averaging, you look at total offense, they're averaging 7 yards per play. That's 11th. You factor in their FCS game where they scored 77 points, I imagine it may be north of 8 yards per play. That's objectively insane, even with their weak strength of schedule. This team is clearly a good team. A lot of it's because of the offense, and I really like what Indiana has done there, so I'm going to give them the edge on the offensive coaching staff. As for the head coach and strength and conditioning, I think this game will determine those things, honestly. If you put a gun to my head, I would say Rule's the more proven head coach, and I'd also say that his strength and conditioning staff is more proven. But I also want to be a little bit forward-thinking. I want to not completely dismiss Indiana because of the weak strength of schedule they've played. After all, ESPN's FPI is telling us Indiana's actually played a tougher strength of schedule than the Huskers. I do think Indiana is good. They look strong. They look conditioned. They don't give up. They have endurance. And the head coach is the CEO. He makes all the hires. All the decisions basically run through him. And Indiana has made good decision after good decision after good decision. So I think it's time that we give Curt Cignetti his flowers. The fact that Indiana at this point is 6-0, unless they completely flame out, and I don't think they will, is indicative of a head coach who knows what he's doing. They're already 6-0. Maybe it's just because of the transfers, but he's had success at James Madison. He's had success at lower levels than that, and he's having success right now at Indiana, who historically is a nothing burger in the Big Ten. This leads me to my prediction. And I am predicting that Indiana covers, and I think that they win, and I think it's going to be something like 28-14. I don't think many field goals will be kicked because Indiana is aggressive. Indiana against Northwestern, I mean, they passed on 4th and inches. That's definition of aggression right there, and they have not kicked many field goals this season. You look at special teams offense, both of these teams attempt less than... They don't attempt less. Nebraska's actually attempted more than 1 field goal per game. They've just missed so many of them that it doesn't matter. Both make less than 1 field goal per game. Nebraska makes 0.4 field goals per game, which is 127th, and Indiana makes 0.8 field goals per game. Indiana, though, has made 100% of their field goal attempts. Nebraska's only made 28.57% of their field goal attempts. Again, that does not count the games against... or the game against Northern Iowa. If you do, which I would because kicking against the FCS is not going to be that much different from the FBS, they're making 44.4% of their field goals, which still is pretty, yikes, pretty terrible. So I don't think a lot of field goals will be kicked. Indiana this season, you look at how they do on 4th down, well, they convert 55.56% of their 4th downs. And how many 4th downs do they have per game? 1.8. And that's not how many they have and then punt. That's how many they have in they go for. They go for close to 2 4th downs per game. That's a lot. They're aggressive. And they don't make all of them, but they make enough to keep you on your toes. And Nebraska, they go for an average of 1.4 4th downs per game. And they have a similar conversion rate, about 57%. I think these teams will go for it. I don't think Nebraska, if they're smart, will attempt a single field goal try. Indiana may attempt one, but I think they're going to want to put this game away, put the chokehold on Nebraska. The reason I have Indiana winning this game by 2 touchdowns is I think that it will be close. It'll be back and forth. I do think Nebraska's defense is going to cause some hiccups for Indiana's offense. But Nebraska's offense has had some major issues, and I do think that Indiana has an above average to good defense. They won't let Nebraska's offense just walk all over them. And I think that at the end of the day, Indiana's superior offense, it's an offense that by most metrics is top 15, top 10. Nebraska's by most metrics is top 10 defensively. But then you look at Indiana's defense, and Indiana's defense, I think, is perhaps, I don't know, I'd say perhaps closer to Nebraska's defense than Nebraska's offense is to Indiana's. Nebraska's offense is much better than it was last year, but as of now, they are worse at running the ball. Part of that's because of the change they've made at quarterback, but something is not right with their rushing attack. And if Raiola has another game like he did against Rutgers, they're certainly not winning here. They're not, because Indiana is that much better than Rutgers on the offensive side of the ball. It'll be close in the fourth quarter or third quarter. I think Indiana will get, whether it's a big play or maybe a long drive that ends up in a score. And because Nebraska can't kick field goals, they'll have to score a touchdown. Probably they'll turn it over on downs or maybe make an errant throw or fumble. And then Indiana will, well, they'll score another touchdown and win 28-14. That's kind of what I'm thinking here. Spread, by the way, is Indiana minus 6.5. That's my prediction for this game. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I think that this is sort of like the Illinois-Michigan game in the sense that it's going to be tricky. I don't think it's easy to tell who's going to win. That's part of the reason I'm excited for it. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Nebraska Rascal and OH for sponsoring this video and channel as Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar Tyler 9, Jilton Kush for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being all-conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Please check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description and down below in the pinned comment. Go Huskers, go Big Red, and go Hoosiers.